America was a nation at a crossroads with the election of Andrew Jackson. The National Republicans, represented by John Quincy Adams, feared that rapid growth of the nation would produce social chaos, and they argued that American authority needed to be centralized by political elites. Jackson's faction, the Democratic Republicans, argued that the greatest danger facing the young nation was the growth of inequality and of privilege, and they came to power in 1839. Thousands of Americans greeted Andrew Jackson at his inauguration, trashing the place, and leading one Supreme Court justice to lament the rise of King Mob in America. Politics now became open to virtually all the nation's white male citizens. Jacksonians hailed the era of the common man. Franchise, or the right to vote, began to expand, and as new states entered the Union, the requirement that men be property owners or taxpayers was gradually lifted, even in the old states, and relatively peacefully. Only with Dorr's rebellion in Rhode Island did the fight to open up elections incite conflict, and that ended with a new state constitution that expanded the vote. The democratization of the nation, of course, was far from complete. In much of the South, no slaves could vote. Even free blacks in the North had trouble casting ballots, and no women could vote in any state. Nowhere was the ballot secret, as it was often spoken aloud, which meant people could be easily bribed or intimidated. Though factional competition had been a very real part of American political system since its inception, it was not until the 1820s and 1830s that most Americans began to accept permanent, institutionalized political parties as a desirable part of the American political process. In New York, political parties became institutionalized on the theory that permanent opposition would force politicians to remain sensitive to the will of the people. I.e., if you won't change, when the people change, if you don't change, another party will. Parties could provide checks and balances to each other in very much the same way that different branches of government checked and balanced each other. President Jackson declared that government should offer equal protection and equal benefits to white male citizens, and favor no one region or class of people. In practice, Jackson sought to empower the rising classes of the South and the West to check the power of the Eastern aristocracy. He implemented the spoil system of political appointments, rewarding his Western and Southern supporters with political appointments and upsetting the old bureaucracy of assumed East Coast political appointees. Jackson implemented the nomination convention when he sought a second term, putting the power of the presidency and the party in the hands of the people rather than the hands of the congressional caucus. Jackson, by his efforts, used the power of the presidency to reduce the strength of the federal government. A concentration of power in Washington, he believed, restricted opportunity to people with political connections, inviting corruption. Jackson, though, was also committed to the preservation of the Union. When John C. Calhoun, an outspoken states' right protectionist from South Carolina, developed his theory of nullification, President Jackson and Martin Van Buren, Jackson's Secretary of State, rose to oppose him. Drawing from the ideas of Madison and Jefferson, Calhoun argued that since the federal government was a creation of the states, not the courts or Congress, were the final arbiters of the constitutionality of federal laws. If the state concluded that Congress had passed an unconstitutional law, a state, he believed, could hold a special convention and declare the federal law null and void within that state. Robert Hayne had used the argument against Daniel Webster in a debate over the speed at which new lands could be incorporated in the West. The argument came to a head during a Democratic Party banquet in honor of Thomas Jefferson, where Jackson and Calhoun traded toasts. Jackson toasted, "Our federal union, it must be preserved," while Calhoun responded, "The Union, next to our liberty, most dear." In 1832, controversy over nullification produced a crisis when South Carolina called a state convention and nullified two federal tariff or tax laws. Jackson insisted that nullification was treason, and he ordered a warship to Charleston. Violence seemed a real possibility. When no state offered political allegiance or alliance with South Carolina, Henry Clay, a newly elected South Carolina senator, was able to navigate a peaceable solution. Though proponents of nullification were able to claim a small victory, Jackson had made it clear that no state could defy the federal government alone. This is sort of similar to Bacon's rebellion. It's an act by a smaller political entity to say, nope, we're in charge. What are you going to do about it? And so the federal government, for the first time, is challenged seriously by a state and wins. Jackson's attitude toward Indian tribes was brutally simple. He wanted them to move west. Since his early military expeditions in Florida, Jackson had harbored a deep hostility toward Indians, not unlike most Americans during this era. In the 18th century, however, Jackson's political forefathers viewed Indians as noble savages with an inherent dignity that made civilization possible among them. In the early 19th century, however, most Americans agreed that Indians were savages who should be removed to lands west of the Mississippi River. Westerners also favored removal to put an end to violence on the frontier, though they mostly wanted easy access to tribal lands. Savage conflicts like the Black Hawk War in the Great Lakes region only reinforced the determination of whites to remove Indian tribes. Remember, when whites had landed on the coast, they looked to Indian tribes for help and assistance. Soon after, as the lands filled up and as whites moved westward, Indians became less beneficial neighbors than just impediments to progress. Many Indian tribes fought back, though. The Cherokee tried to stop the state of Georgia from taking their lands by appealing directly to the United States Supreme Court. Though the Supreme Court found favor with the tribe, Jackson repudiated the Supreme Court decisions and sent an army of 7,000 to round the Cherokee up and drive them westward. Roughly 1,000 Cherokee fled to North Carolina, where their descendants still live today. The majority, though, made the long trek to Indian Territory in modern-day Oklahoma, beginning in the winter of 1839. Thousands died on that march, and the survivors remembered the terrible journey as a trail of tears. Of the 5 civilized tribes of the American Southeast, and they are the Cherokee, the Creek, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw, only members of the Seminole tribe in Florida and the escaped black slaves living in their midst were able to resist the pressure to emigrate west when they defeated the American Army in the Everglades. By 1840, Indian tribes had ceded over 100 million acres to the federal government in return for $68 million and 32 million acres of far less hospitable lands west of the Mississippi. There they lived, divided by tribe into a series of separate and disparate reservations, in a territory surrounded by a string of U.S. Army forts. While there was probably never any realistic possibility that the government could stop white expansion westward, there were alternatives proposed to the brutal removal policies of the era. The history of the American West was filled with examples of white settlers and native tribes living side by side. In the pueblos of New Mexico and the fur trading outposts of the Pacific Northwest, in parts of Texas and California, settlers from Mexico, France, Canada, and the United States had created societies in which Indians and whites mixed in relative coexistence, usually out of necessity. But President Jackson was willing to use federal force against Indians. He was reluctant to use it in other contexts, including in matters of business and economics. The Bank of the United States held a monopoly on federal deposits and provided credit to growing enterprises, issued dependable banknotes — remember, we don't have dollars yet — and served as a dependable medium of exchange and moderation in an era of wild and irregular banking practices. And as a representative of hard money interests, and as a man opposed to state-sponsored bank-issued notes entirely, Jackson wanted to destroy it. The continuation of the Bank of the United States emerged as the paramount issue of the 1832 presidential election, and Henry Clay took up the cause of the bank on behalf of the Whig Party, seeking to renew its charter 4 years ahead of schedule. Bank, that is. The bank war, though, failed to provide Clay with a winning issue. Jackson won 55% of the popular vote in that election on his way to a second presidential term. Though Jackson could not legally abolish the bank during its charter, he removed the government's deposits, firing 2 secretaries of Treasury to do so. Only the third would do it. During the ensuing economic recession, the country was left with an undeniably fragmented and chronically unstable banking system. This sounds very obscure, but we trust the Federal Reserve of the United States to set interest rates, etc. They do have total sort of unaccounted or unaccountable control for our money system. We trust sort of a branch of our federal government to sort of deal with our money, to print and back our dollars. And this is an issue that Jackson wanted to avoid. He wanted people to sort of have commerce between themselves without the interference of the government, so to speak. So he didn't want the government to sort of certify dollars. A transaction between people, he didn't want the government interested in or a necessary component of, if that makes sense. So he goes out of his way to destroy the federal government's sort of weak interest and ability to sort of influence the monetary system in early America. After the Bank War, Jackson moved against the most powerful remaining institution of economic nationalism, the Supreme Court. In 1835, after Chief Justice John Marshall died, the president appointed his former Secretary of the Treasury, a man named Taney, to the Supreme Court. He was the same man who had consented to defunding the National Bank. Taney's opinions and decisions echoed Jackson's own ideology. that government existed to expand the economic opportunity of the people, which would not be possible if older economic interests, government agencies, and corporations were allowed to dominate the economy. Jackson's decidedly hardline tactics galvanized a growing coalition opposed to the president's use of power. Denouncing the president as King Andrew I, they began to refer to themselves as Whigs, taking the name of the party in England that traditionally worked to limit the power of the king. With the emergence of the Whig Party, America had formalized its second-party system that we recognize today, i.e. Republicans and Democrats. The Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson believed that the power of government should be limited, except to the degree that it worked to eliminate social and economic arrangements that entrenched privilege and stifled opportunity. And that's what Jackson feared the National Bank would do, that it would entrench privilege in the Eastern aristocracy and stifle opportunity for Westerners. Democrats celebrated simple farmers and honest workers and contrasted them to corrupt, monopolistic, aristocratic forces of established wealth from older. They supported territorial expansion by the people, and their most radical members called for strong, even violent assaults on monopoly and privilege. The Whigs, in contrast, favored the expansion of federal power and industrial and commercial development. Whigs were cautious about westward expansion and feared that rapid growth would produce instability, and they favored entrepreneurs and institutions that most effectively promoted economic growth. Though they tended to attract different sorts of people, both political parties were more interested in winning elections than maintaining philosophical or ideological purity, and they made adjustments to their ideology from region to region in order to attract the most votes. So a Whig in South Carolina might say and talk and act a lot different than a Whig in Kentucky. While Democrats were firmly united behind Jackson, the Whigs tended to divide their allegiance between the great triumvirate of Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. As such, while Whigs competed well in congressional, state, and local races, they ran different presidential candidates in different parts of the country, hoping to throw the election to the House of Representatives, and they managed to only win 2 presidential elections in their more than 20 years of national prominence because they ran to different people in different parts of the country to try to appeal to them. Didn't work that well. Just before Martin Van Buren, a Democrat in the vein of Jackson, was elected as president in 1836, an economic boom swept the nation. Land prices picked up, credit was plentiful, and the government sold enough of its land holdings to have a surplus in its treasury. This is the first and only time this ever occurred, that the federal government had more money than it owed to other people. The federal government, in response, gave the surplus back to the states, who invested it in highways, railroads, and canals. Jackson, however, adopted a policy of accepting only gold or silver currency for government land in an executive order called the Specie Circular. The new policy sparked a drop in confidence in banknotes, and Van Buren began his term just as the nation headed into an unprecedented 5-year economic depression. What Jackson is really opposed to is the idea that the wealthy people of the East Coast could sort of get credit based on where they lived and who they were. He hated that the people of these new territories in the West and the less prosperous people of the South sort of being, or could be, held back by an economic system that sort of favored the people with political connections in the East Coast. That's why he adopts a policy of only gold or silver in government. He doesn't want credit to be worth anything. He wants gold or silver, hard money, to be the law of the land in the United States. Though President Van Buren presided over a few legislative achievements, his proposal for a new independent financial system established our current federally backed banking system. As he sought re-election, the Whigs settled on a single candidate for nomination, William Henry Harrison, a soldier of renown and a popular national figure. He faced off against Van Buren in 1840. It was the first campaign in which the new and popular penny press, a newspaper, carried sensationalistic news of the candidates to large audiences, which in turn made the candidates focus more on the everyman voter in American politics for the first time. Both parties used the same techniques of mass voter appeal. The Whigs, in particular, were able to paint Harrison, a wealthy member of the frontier elite with a considerable estate, as a simple man of the people who loved log cabins and hard cider. The Democrats took the fall for the economic depression, and Harrison won the election handily, though he died of pneumonia only 1 month into his term. He was succeeded by Vice President John Tyler. Tyler, who had been a Democrat previously, frustrated Whigs and ended up actually aligning himself with a small faction of Southern conservative Whigs who favored rejoining the Democratic Party. In the midst of these domestic controversies, international politics took center stage. when anti-British factions in Canada launched an unsuccessful rebellion against the colonial government in 1837, an American steamship, the Caroline, got caught up in the conflict and was set on fire. Resentment in the United States grew rapidly. A simmering conflict over a border between Maine and British Canada flared up in response, pitting Canadian and American lumberjacks against British soldiers in a brawl that became known as the Aroostook War. Later, when an American slave ship, the Creole, was seized by its captive slaves on its way to New Orleans, the British responded by declaring the slaves free men once they reached the Bahamas. By then, or roughly then, the British had outlawed slavery. Only a conciliatory British government in Great Britain, essentially the opposite of King George III's government, salved Anglo-American relations. Under Whig leadership, the United States established its first diplomatic relations with China with the Treaty of Wanhai, but international successes and peace were not enough for the Whigs to hold on to power, as James K. Polk, a Democrat with an explicit agenda of westward expansion, won the White House in 1844.